Hello, my name is Phil Temple. I'm Assistant Head Teacher, Prince Henry's Grammar School, with responsibility for student support. I'm going to present to you some information around child protection and safeguarding and the various processes that we use in our school to ensure that all children are safe. Just to explain my role a little more, I'm the designated safeguarding lead in school, and I have responsibility for both the behaviour and welfare of all children in school and staff. And this presentation specifically addresses some of those responsibilities around child protection and safeguarding. So, just to begin, I'd just like to draw your attention to a quote from a document called Working Together to Safeguard Children, which was a document written in response to a case in London of a young girl called Victoria Climbier. In the review of that case, the serious case review, it was found that one of the key issues were that communication around child protection wasn't effective, both between agencies and actually within agencies, schools, social care and the like. And so one of the key messages from that document is that the welfare of children is a corporate responsibility. What I take to mean by that is that everybody within the organisation has a responsibility for the well-being of young people, and that they need to take that seriously and ensure that they do the aspects of their role that are relevant to the best of their ability. So I'm going to cover two particular areas in this presentation. One is the safeguarding of children and one is specifically around child protection. So there is a subtle difference between the two. Safeguarding are those actions and activities that we undertake to make sure that all children are safe, to present them with the skills to keep themselves safe, and to share information where appropriate, and to make a safe environment for them within school. Child protection more specifically is about the responses to a particular situation where a young person or young people are deemed to be at risk, and the things we do then to ensure that they are safe and well. So an exercise that I would do usually with people in the room around this is the following. Now, what I would like you to do, if you're watching this at home, rather than work with anybody who's next to you, is just pause the video in just a second and try and think about some of the areas that you would contribute to the safeguarding agenda. Now, just to be clear, whilst this question references an inspector coming into school, this is not about Ofsted and about trying to tick boxes. It's just a way to frame the thought process that we need to go through. So within the role that you are going to be undertaking at Prince Henry's Grammar School, what sort of things do you think you would do to contribute to the safeguarding agenda? And more broadly, what do you think the school need to do around that? I'll just get you to pause for just a second and think about that, and I'll move on, ready for when you're ready. So hopefully in thinking around that, you've come up with some of the areas that are here on this slide. There are a number of things here, and I won't go through all of them. Some are reasonably self-explanatory, but just to pick up one or two. First of all, some of the things on here you may well not come across in your specific role. For example, intimate care and restraint. Specific members of staff within school may need to consider that more as more relevant to their role. It's very rare that we need to restrain children at Prince Henry's Grammar School, and I will do a separate presentation around our behaviour system, which talks a little bit more about how we would escalate concerns in a situation. But it is an area of that we need to think about, and always maintaining the safety of children as our number one priority in any situation. One or two other things that are picked up upon here. Early help, maybe something you're not a phrase you're not familiar with, and those are all of the processes that we go through to support young people over and above the universal provision which occurs in school. So that might be working under an early help plan, or a young person who's receiving counselling or mentoring of some sort. There are a number of things there that the pastoral team and the safeguarding team take a lead on. Attendance is crucially important. It seems fairly obvious that if you don't know where a child is, you can't keep them safe. So it's important that we have good attendance. It's important that we monitor attendance effectively. The responsibilities in our school are twofold around attendance. One is that we take an AM and a PM official register, but actually the expectation is that in every lesson that we teach, we do take a register of the children in front of us and input that onto Sims so that we know very quickly if anybody is missing. We don't have a sealed site. It is possible for children to leave the site during the day undetected, and therefore attendance registers are crucially important. Yeah. A number of other things on there that may be worth just picking up on. So safer recruitment as an example. As an institution, we're obliged to engage in safer recruitment. You may well have noticed that in the application that you put in for the role that you are about to take up, there's some very clear statements in the literature there about safer recruitment and about what we as a school undergo or undertake to make sure that all recruitment is safe. So, what are the responsibilities for all of us as individuals and as an institution? So, teacher standards from 2012 state quite clearly some of those responsibilities, and they state that teachers, including head teachers, should safeguard the children's well-being and maintain public trust in the teaching profession as part of their professional duties. I think it's important to big up the profession at this point. We're an important part of all young people's lives. Whatever role we undertake in school, whether we be teaching staff, support staff, or ancillary staff of any other kind in school, we all have a role to play, as I said right at the start of this presentation, in supporting young people. We have a responsibility to provide a safe environment in which children can learn. And then the bottom one there just talks a little bit also about our responsibility to identify children who may be in need of extra help or who are suffering or likely to suffer significant harm. Now that phrase is an important one, significant harm, and it's also somewhat difficult to pin down in the sense that what one person considers to be significant harm, another person may not agree. But I think we can all agree that we need to do what we can to reduce that and to support any child who is at risk. And that's really what this is about. All staff then have a responsibility to take appropriate action, working with other services when needed. So, school responsibilities. One is that the school is obliged to have a designated safeguarding lead who is a member of the senior leadership team. In our case, that's myself. It's worth noting that the law says quite clearly now that if there is not a member of the senior leadership team who takes upon that role, then the head teacher by default must do so. And that's following a case in Norfolk a few years ago in a small village school where there were only 2 members of staff, where the designated safeguarding role was actually given to a newly qualified teacher. And for a range of different reasons, conversations didn't take place around a young girl who was at risk. And actually it ended up in a very sad situation where that young girl was killed. The nature of that being the case, the response to that, was that all schools are responsible for making sure that a member of their senior team takes that role. The biggest single issue in that case was that a difficult conversation didn't take place with a parent and a member of staff, and as such, things were missed. It's quite a difficult thing to do, and it's important that somebody with the appropriate seniority is given that role. Within our school, I have a deputy, Steve Knight, who's the Key Stage 4 Progress Leader, and he deputises on all aspects of safeguarding. He's also responsible for CPOMS, which is our electronic monitoring system, which I'll mention again in a second. On a practical basis, each of our year managers are designated staff. That means they've all undertaken external training to support children around child protection and safeguarding issues. And they will often be your first port of call within school, as they know their children extremely well and are very experienced in supporting staff and children. Now, our responsibilities as designated staff are to monitor and record any issues that arise, any activity around child protection, and any concerns raised by staff, to refer those things on as appropriate, and to work with other agencies or to work within school without other agencies to support those young people as best we possibly can. We have a responsibility to ensure that all staff and visitors are familiar with the child protection arrangements. Part of that obviously is what I'm doing now. It's crucially important that everybody within the building understands their own responsibilities. So visitors to the school are reminded of that with a booklet when they arrive, and staff coming into school receive this presentation and other information. We engage in safer recruitment, as already mentioned. Every panel in our school has a member of staff who has completed safe recruitment training from the senior leadership team who leads that panel. We have a nominated governor, in our case a lady called Shane Wells, And we also have to ensure that all staff undergo training every 3 years. So this presentation or something similar is presented to staff every 3 years, regardless of when they've been inducted to school. And that's really important. It's a little bit like when you get on the aeroplane and they give you the safety talk. It really is important that when issues arise, we get it right, and therefore all staff are obliged to undergo that training every 3 years. The single most important thing, which I brushed over a little bit on one of my previous slides, is the curriculum. How do you keep children safe? Well, the best way, of course, is to give them the skills and abilities to keep themselves safe. So the curriculum is crucially important, both our PSHE curriculum, but also everything that we do across the school. Whilst we teach children about specific issues around sex education, drugs and the like, it's also important that we build confident learners and young people who are able to take the necessary steps and precautions to keep themselves safe in a fully informed way. So contributing to child protection and safeguarding through the curriculum is really quite important. So, as an individual member of staff, what are your responsibilities? So firstly, you are obliged to read part 1 of Keeping Children Safe in Education and Appendix A. Now, you should have been provided with that document as well as the link to this video. And along with the next 2 documents that I mentioned, you will be asked by ourselves and the HR team to sign a pro forma to say that you've read those documents and are happy to work within the expectations of those. Now, as Keeping Children Safe in Education is regularly updated, at the time of recording this video, we're currently on 2019 version, there are often updates in September, and it's my responsibility to share any amendments or addendums with all of the staff. But I'll be covering in just a second the key aspects of that document. I'll be doing the same with the Leeds Safe Working Practice Guidance, which you again are expected to be familiar with and to operate within the auspices of, and also our child protection policy, which actually draws from both of those documents and is based on the Leeds model policy for child protection, specifically the issues around confidentiality. It's important that you be alert to signs and indicators of possible abuse, and we'll go on to look at how we might recognise those in a few moments. As I've mentioned already, we run in school a system called CPOMS, which is an electronic system of recording and reporting any concerns we may have around young people. You'll be given by Steve Knight a login and details on how to actually access that system when you start working at Prince Henry's. It's also important that we deal with disclosures of any concerns in line with recommendations, and I'll specifically go through that in a later slide. So one of the things that I do like to just pull out from the Keeping Children Safe in Education document is an issue of challenging and reporting any worrying behaviour and practice by other adults. This is really designed to give people confidence in the judgments that they make and the actions that they take. And really the mantra within that is to think not what if I'm wrong, but what if I'm right. Essentially, you are able to make judgments around behaviour and what you think is and isn't appropriate. And if you have concerns about the behaviour of one of your colleagues, it's important. Not only do you have the right to do so, but you actually have a responsibility to raise those concerns with the appropriate member of staff. It should really be raised directly with the head teacher, or if it relates to the head teacher, the chair of governors, or myself as a DSL, which is actually a more practical route forward given how schools operate. If you are concerned about doing so, or more specifically you're concerned about the response from myself or the head teacher, you are of course also within your rights to approach the local authority designated officer. I would hope that in all situations a resolution would have taken place, or that you'd be confident that we'd be taking the necessary actions within school. But you do have a legal right to do that if you are concerned about something in school to the extent that you feel somebody needs to do something about it. So some statistics, really just to drill home what is unfortunately quite a negative message in many ways. But it is really important that we recognise that the things I'm talking about here are not things that happen elsewhere. These are concerns within our school, just as they are concerns within all schools in the country. So some of these figures speak for themselves, but what you'll notice, I think, is that the trend of increase amongst all of these figures. And what we have is a situation where um, with better recording and reporting, better process in school, but also some of the other broader concerns across society, an increased level of need for children. Whilst I'd be the last person in any way to talk about a link between child protection concerns and poverty, in the sense of not being able to support young people, as somebody who's financially struggling, it seems obvious that with increased levels of deprivation, you're going to see increased concerns around neglect and the like, and therefore we don't see at the moment these numbers starting to tail off. What's important for you to recognise is that whilst we may work in an affluent, leafy part of the city, we do have concerns in our school. We're a fully comprehensive school also, so we draw from a full range of social circumstances. But as I've kind of alluded to there as well, that's only partly relevant. I have 85 ongoing cases in school at the moment, so it's important that you realise that this is an issue that affects our school just as it does any other. So very quickly go through the definitions of the 4 areas of abuse. These do appear in the documents that I've already mentioned and that you should have already received. And so I won't dwell on this for any great time, not least because it doesn't make particularly pleasant reading, but it is important that we recognise what we're talking about. Neglect's a very difficult thing to pin down because it's about the persistent failure to meet basic needs. In some situations, it's fairly obvious. In others, it's a little bit more difficult to establish. And that's one of the reasons why that regular recording and reviewing and monitoring of information from staff is so crucially important. A couple of things moving on. Firstly, physical abuse, which in itself is quite high profile, but in some ways, as the designated safeguarding lead, is a more straightforward thing to actually deal with, in that there are a very clear set of actions, and often it's quite apparent that these things occur. Although it is sometimes difficult to pick up causes for concern around this, particularly with teenagers. Sexual abuse is often what we think of when we talk about child protection, and thankfully, in comparison to some of the other areas we've talked about and will talk about, it's relatively low numbers. But there's a couple of things within this definition that I did just want to pick up on. That which I've highlighted there, where it talks about non-contact activities involving children looking at or in the production of sexual images or watching sexual activities, encouraging children to behave in sexually inappropriate ways, or grooming a child in preparation for abuse via the internet. Certainly in recent years, in my role, the increase in the amount of inappropriate images that are being shared, both by children and adults, actually, is a huge concern. And often, actually, the biggest challenge is dealing with children who are sharing images of other children and not necessarily even recognising that they're contributing or engaging in what are child protection concerns. So these are really important issues that certainly myself as a designated safeguarding lead and the rest of the team deal with all of the time. It's really important that when we hear some of the things that children are engaging in, or hear about or see some of the things that they are sharing, that we don't allow that to be normalised. This is still of concern, even if it is becoming an increasing part of what children are doing as part of their social activities. Emotional abuse is a difficult thing to pin down also. It talks in there about a number of things. I like to pick up specifically that point about age or developmentally inappropriate expectations being imposed on children. So we often think about emotional abuse being that idea of being quite bullying towards children, of reducing their self-esteem, and some of those things that you might think as being fairly obvious aspects of this. But there are also challenges there where, with parents who are not necessarily trying or engaging in things that are clearly inappropriate. But certainly in our school, we have a lot of issues around the mental well-being of quite high achieving children, specifically the girls, actually, where they're not able to meet those extremely high expectations upon them. It's particularly relevant for children with special educational needs who may not be able to actually achieve or complete things to a level that other people can, and actually, if we're inappropriate in how we or what we expect of children, that in itself is a form of emotional abuse. Now, going back to the point I made earlier around significant harm, it is of course difficult to judge where aspirational parenting tips over into emotional abuse. Some things are fairly obvious, other things are more grey. But it is important that we're always aware that young people are very receptive to how they're being treated and to the way that people deal with them. And so emotional abuse is a really quite important thing to consider. And of course, it is something that appears in each of those other definitions. Almost by definition, if you are suffering an abusive situation, you are being emotionally abused at the same time. So some specific issues that we may come across in school. We've talked there about general definitions. These are some of the things that specifically might come up in school. All of those, in certainly my time in schools in Leeds and more recently in the last 10 years in Otley, are things that I've come across. So they do all happen, although obviously some are more prevalent than others. Some of these things are things that we're expected, under keeping children safe in education, to be aware of and to consider our responses to. Some are more regular causes for concern, but all of them are things that we would need to consider. Mental health's on that list. Clearly there are safeguarding issues around that, and we've done a huge amount of work in the last few years trying to improve and expand our mental health provision. We do have mental health first aiders in school. We have access to counselling for students, and we are signed up to the MindMade programme through Leeds. We are a MindMade champion school to try and help support all young people and adults in school, because often that's associated with any of these other issues as well. Drug and alcohol awareness, again, a fairly obvious thing to have on that list, but there is a prevalence of drug misuse within the community, I think at all schools. Otley is no different, and in our community it's something that we do need to challenge and look to try and educate children of around as best we can. Without reading the whole of the list, you can see that there are a number of things there that we would need to be considering. So, what are the signs and indicators that we may pick up upon as professionals in schools? They fall into three areas for each of those forms of abuse: physical changes or physical indicators, bruising and the like, a dishevelled appearance and things of that nature, the behaviour of that child, and actually how they are feeling as well. Now, again, I would often ask people in groups to consider what these signs and indicators are and to talk about them and write those down. I'm going to show you some lists that are not exhaustive, but if you want to just pause the video for a second and again think what some of those indicators and signs might be that you in your role would come across, and then we'll have a look at those lists together. So these are not exhaustive lists by any means, but they do cover the majority of things that we may come across in school. And again, without reading the lists to you, there are a few things just to pick out upon there. And some of these also highlight the difficulty in dealing with child protection concerns and in identifying where there are concerns. So the very top of the list around neglect, tired and listless. Well, we often find that teenagers appear as such, and it can be difficult to deal with. But I think, again, it's about applying a level of both common sense and professional judgment. At what point does being a fairly stereotypically grumpy teenager and tired all the time tip over into a concerning level of tiredness and listlessness? Same with being unkempt and poor hygiene. Anybody who's dealt with teenage boys for a long time recognise that that's not necessarily unusual. But I think, again, there are times when we need to make a judgment about that. A number of other things that we may or may not be aware of in our individual role within school. But certainly when we start to see a pattern of some of these things, then those are things that would leave us really concerned. You'll note that attendance is in there, which I've already mentioned. And with neglect, often there are a lot of physical signs that we would pick up upon, poor growth and the like. And in that situation, we would almost inevitably be working with other agencies to try and establish some of those things. But you can see from some of those things, like few friends, not having the right equipment, that those are things that really need to be noticed by people around school, classroom teachers and others who are going to see those things. And that flow of information to myself and the rest of the designated team is crucially important in picking up patterns of concern for children. When it comes to emotional abuse, again, there are one or two other things on there. We often see sort of extremes of attention-seeking behaviour, or actually the opposite as well. People not wanting attention and not necessarily knowing how to regulate that behaviour in classrooms and beyond. They're over ready to relate to others and be empathetic because they're trying to find a connection with somebody. Low self-esteem appears in there, and of course would appear across all of these things. But there are a number of things that I think we might pick up in our observations of that child's behaviour or interactions with others. So yeah, things for you to consider. It's interesting, isn't it, that as you go down one or two of those things might equally apply to adults within school as well, and people who perhaps are not coping as well as we would like. And I said at the start that part of my role is in supporting staff as well, actually. And it's important that we're vigilant and caring within our school community. Drink, drug and solvent abuse appears in there. And again, the link there between the attempt to find an artificial way of feeling more positive when perhaps starved of that emotional support is a fairly obvious one, but something that we do need to consider. And making judgments, separating out what might be normal teenage experimentation with really concerning behaviour around drink and drugs is quite difficult, but it's something that we can only do with information sharing and open discussion with other colleagues where appropriate from the designated team. Again, two lists that are not exhaustive, things for us to consider. Unexplained injuries. We often see children in school who are injured, not least from playing in our school sports teams. But I think there's a very big difference between somebody who turns up with a black eye one week from a rugby match and somebody who's regularly arriving at school with injuries that they can't really explain, or that the explanations are slightly woolly for. Injuries on certain parts of the body. For example, it may be entirely as expected to see injuries on the lower limbs of somebody who's playing in the rugby team or the football team, probably less so on somebody who is using a wheelchair to move around school. So aspects of knowing your children and knowing the individual circumstances are really quite important as well for this. Afraid of home. A child who doesn't want to leave the building is always there late in the afternoon, waiting to the last moment before they go home. All of these point to me, or one of the key things that we need to be aware of here, is that with many of these, we can only really identify them by having a good understanding of the children in our care to begin with, because the vast majority of these really can be covered up in that idea of there being changes around behaviour or changes in how that child presents. So it's crucially important that we recognise that knowing our children well, taking the time to care about them and to involve ourselves in them and speak to them is really the best way to lead to keeping them safe. So, we mentioned disclosures, and whilst it's rare to have a child actively disclose to us, it does happen in school. It tends to happen in most two groups of staff in school: those who are new to school and perhaps those who are younger, and those members of staff who have been there a longer time. There's probably a reason to that, whether that be testing out new staff to see how their responses are, or perhaps with older staff where there's a level of trust that's built up that those people might take things more seriously. But it can happen to any member of staff, and there are a number of things that we would state as do's and don'ts, and I just want to go through each of those now. Really important that we take children seriously when they're telling us things. It's very rare actually for children to lie about abuse, although it does happen. It's very rare, and it's really important that we take seriously what they're saying. We listen carefully to what's being said to us. We don't just presume that we know where that conversation is going, or that we understand what they're saying. We might want to clarify that, but we do need to listen carefully. Asking open questions, giving the opportunity for the child to actually telling you in their own words what it is that they want you to know. Closed questions can be unhelpful because they can lead to simple yes no answers and actually also lead us to the wrong conclusions about what's being said to us. It's important that we check that we've understood what we've been told and that we have that right. It's important to remain calm, however difficult that may be. One of the things that I'm responsible for following a disclosure is for giving the time to that member of staff to ensure that they feel okay about what's happened and get the support that they might need. It can be a very difficult thing to hear a child talk to you about a distressing situation. It's important that we reassure children that they've done the right thing. That's not the same as reassuring them that you're going to fix a problem, because that's not necessarily what you're going to be able to do. But it's always important that they know that telling you was the right and appropriate thing to do and that you'll deal with it as best you can. It's crucially important that we're honest about what we will do with that information. You need to tell that child that you'll pass that information on, and to whom, whether that be myself or the appropriate year manager. That really goes to the point at which you're asked also, perhaps prior to a disclosure, whether you're in a position to keep information secret. So if a child does approach you and say, "Sir, miss, if I tell you something, do you promise not to tell anyone?" It's crucially important that we don't say yes. There are two reasons for that. One, you're simply not allowed to, and I'm telling you that now. But actually the more important reason is why we don't want that. We need that child to understand exactly how you will act to support them, and that we follow through on that. We need to be trusted adults who get this right, and it's really important that that starts right from the point at which that conversation begins. So my response to a child who asks me to keep a secret would be, well, I don't know what you're going to tell me. What I can promise is I'll do the best I can to try and help you out, but I might have to tell somebody, depending on what it is. Your job then is to pass that information on to myself or another member of designated staff in accordance with our school procedures. So we do have cause of concern forms, but as mentioned, we do use CPOMS, which is our electronic system, and it has the benefit of automatically alerting the member of staff who you are passing that information to, so that they can check that immediately. It's worth saying at this point that child protection and safeguarding trumps everything else in school within my remit, and actually across anybody's remit. And if you have a serious concern about a child, there isn't anything that's going on in school that I would take issue with you interrupting to share information around child protection and safeguarding. So if you feel that something must be followed up straight away, then it's absolutely fine to interrupt myself or any of the designated staff in whatever situation they are at that time. Most information can simply be shared through CPOMS, or a conversation can take place later, but there are occasionally things that are really quite urgent, and it's important that staff are confident that they won't receive a negative response to that. I would never certainly do that if you were to interrupt me for a child protection issue. There are some don'ts on there as well. It's not our job to investigate, or certainly it isn't the job of the broader staff. It may occasionally be the job of myself and my team to investigate a little bit further and to make sure we've got some extra information. But that's not our role. It's not our role to ask leading questions either, as we said. Difficult as it may be, it's important to try not to look shocked or embarrassed. That child probably feels really vulnerable in telling you this information, probably is well aware that the information that they're sharing is not something that's very palatable, but that probably not helpful for them to have someone appear shocked or embarrassed. That's very difficult for them to deal with. It's not our role to speculate. We must share the information we're given in the way it's given, and when we share information on CPOMS, we would write down that information verbatim, not to speculate what we think something might mean. That interpretation might be for a later time from myself. It's not what I require from you. I require what the child said. Don't pass an opinion about the alleged perpetrator. Again, an extremely difficult thing to do when we've heard distressing information. What we might say to a child is that we don't think that thing should be happening to them, but it's not appropriate to say to them negative things about that person. Bear in mind, in the vast majority of cases where abuse is being reported, it is disclosure around somebody who either is a member of the family or a very close friend. And often the feelings from that child are very complicated, and whilst they might not be happy with some of the behaviour that's ongoing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to hear negative things said about that person. So don't make negative comments. Do not take photographs of injuries. It's not appropriate to do so, and actually you put yourself at a huge risk of allegation around that. So please don't take photographs of injuries. If that was something that was appropriate further down the conversations that would be ongoing, that's something that would be undertaken with other agencies in that discussion. I've already mentioned not promising to keep secrets and not delaying getting help. The last thing around that is around confidentiality. It says do not share information inappropriately. There is a challenge in this, in that sharing information often is what's necessary to keep a child safe, but it's important that that's shared with the correct person. It's entirely appropriate to say to a colleague in a situation, well, I have a child who has told me something that's concerning me. Who do I speak to? What do I do? It wouldn't be appropriate to share names and details around that in the staff room. It's really important that we are respecting the rights of that child to have confidentiality and sharing only with those people who need to know that information. Myself, the designated team. Thank you.